To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you. Your support truly makes this show possible, and we couldn't do any of this without you. If you value our work and want to help us keep this project going, become a patron. We rely on listeners like you to sustain the show. Join at patreon.com/deathpanelpod and get access to weekly bonus episodes, as well as our full back catalog with hundreds of hours of bonus content. And to help us out some more, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, hold reading or discussion groups, share the show with someone who needs to hear it, and of course, you can also follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and I'm here today with my co-hosts, Artie Vierkant.
Hello.
And Phil Rocco.
Hi.
And we are just starting week 3 of Trump's second term, and the administration has wasted no time in grinding essential government functions to a halt. In the first 2 weeks, we've seen health agency communications cut off, including the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a cornerstone of public health tracking that has run continuously since the 1950s. NIH and National Science Foundation funding was temporarily put on hold, jeopardizing critical research. And perhaps most alarmingly, the Office of Management and Budget issued a memo early last week calling for an immediate freeze on certain federal grants and financing under the absurd pretense of purging so-called wokeness, Marxist equity, Green New Deal social engineering, and transgenderism, among other right-wing boogeymen, in compliance with some of the executive orders that have been released about rooting out DEI. While this memo was partially walked back after immediate backlash, its intent was quite clear: to lay the groundwork for an administration that will aggressively weaponize federal funding, punish states that don't fall in line, and dismantle what remains of the administrative state under the guise of ideological purification. Now, the memo sent states into a panic, since on average, nearly a third of their budgets come from federal funding. But let's be clear, even the partial retreat doesn't mean that the threat is gone. And while some of these actions might seem like bureaucratic confusion or political theater, they're neither. This isn't just chaos, it's a deliberate escalation of the right's long-running project to gut the administrative state, consolidate executive power, and starve the public of the resources that it needs to function. Now, later this week, we have an episode coming out where myself and Jules speak with Melissa Gira-Grant about 3 of the executive orders that specifically target trans people. So in today's episode, we're going to walk through what some of these other moves within the administrative state really mean, how they reflect a power grab that threatens not just individual policies, but the entire structure of governance. We'll break down the immediate and potential long-term impacts, the broader ideological project at play, and talk about what all of this tells us about where the administration might be headed. Because if there's one thing these last 2 weeks have reinforced, it's that when the right comes for the administrative state, they aren't doing it to make life easier for working people. They're doing it towards centralizing power and resources exactly where they've always wanted them, concentrated at the top.
Right. So as B said, there's been a lot of activity in the last week, and it's been quite chaotic, though, chaotic doesn't mean without purpose or structure, I think, yeah. As I believe a lot of people have been kind of characterizing it this week as if, Trump was blundering his way into this manufactured crisis. But, I think a lot of discussion of this in the media, especially the early takes about it, seem to have really downplayed the threat going on here, if only by leaving it highly technical. I mean, because it is highly technical. But,
yeah, it's so complex is the easy frame. Like, if you really don't want to do real reporting, you want to just do the sort of stenographic thing. It's like, yeah, it's all complex. Well, of course that's true, but that really doesn't give much of a handle on what power is, how it's working.
Yeah, it's easy to throw up your hands at this. One thing I've been thinking about a lot, actually, over the last week is, I'm sure you guys remember this. Do you remember in 2016 when Steve Bannon was more in Trump's direct orbit and in the White House? And I remember a lot of liberals being like, Steve Bannon says he wants to dismantle the administrative state. Administrative state. What does that even mean? You know what I mean? But all that is to say, it's easy to kind of dismiss this as really technical, because while some of these changes are really blunt and bombastic, others are really esoteric and have more to do with government systems that aren't usually big focal points of public discourse. So I think one of the things that we thought we'd do at the top of the episode is just run through a number of the things that the Trump administration has done in the last week and try to explain them, reference some of these. But I think also it'd just be good to take a moment to explain how all of these things aren't sort of just chaos or unrelated, but are actually deeply related to each other.
Yeah. And to sort of create like a picture of how they all together make a larger argument.
Yeah. And so I would just say in broad strokes, firstly, to go back to some of the stuff that started about a week ago, firstly, they're claiming sweeping authority. The Trump administration is claiming sweeping authority over government spending, deciding that they can cut off funding of any program that they want if it doesn't fit their ideological agenda. This is what last week's memo fiasco was all about. Their declaration from the Office of Management and Budget of a temporary freeze on, quote, all federal financial assistance programs. They directed agencies to freeze funding immediately and to conduct a thorough audit to purge any funding the administration would see as payments promoting, as B referred to in the opener, quote, wokeness or, quote, Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering, using Trump's first executive orders in office as a flimsy justification for this. And while that memo has been walked back, they sort of sent out a subsequent memo rescinding that original memo after a judge had stepped in to halt that process. It did have a lot of immediate effects in terms of freezing government funding that we're going to be talking about. I know Phil identified something that happened, for example, with HHS funding to a Center for Community Living in West Virginia, for example. I'd love to be able to talk about that in a second. And this was, of course, led to, I think, a couple of days, 24 to 48 hours of really speculation that was entirely focused on, is Medicaid part of this? Is this program or that program part of this? Focused on like, oh, what parts are they saying they're freezing, as opposed to being focused on, they are quite literally overstepping their constitutional powers. The power of the purse is basically like Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, in any case. Secondly, as a backup to this, you could say, a backup for if agencies will not perhaps comply with this directive that they are seeking to ideologically root out government funding to sources that the new Trump administration doesn't agree with. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, has infiltrated the Treasury's payment system, which is the federal architecture that literally sends out all government payments, from NIH grants to payments to states for programs like Medicaid, to payments to hospitals and other healthcare settings under Medicare, payments to individuals like Social Security disability insurance, or tax returns, payments to government employees, things like that. Theoretically, this would essentially give them a backdoor to manually freeze government payments, even if federal agencies don't comply. As in, let's say that Trump orders officials at CMS to shut down payments to hospitals under Medicare Part A, which RFK Jr., if you're listening to this, that's what Medicare Part A does. But let's say CMS doesn't want to comply. They refuse to shut that down because they know it could single-handedly cause a financial crisis if all of a sudden, like, the biggest, financier of the hospital system in the United States stops paying.
Which, by the way, there were memos going out within agencies after the OMB memo was released, and it was, enjoined by a court that basically said, look, you can't stop payment on things. This memo is now been enjoined by a court. So there is like this sense in which there's like all of this essentially like rule following architecture in federal agencies to stop something that is like patently illegal from happening. But that's why this sort of Musk takeover of the Bureau of Fiscal Service seems to be important, because if you can literally shut off payments, again, totally illegally, you circumvent the agencies that are going to tell you no. Yeah,
totally. Then, herein lies the problem. People can just call it simply illegal, all that they want. It depends on whether someone's going to stop, like whether we're going to be able to stop this from happening, right? You know what I mean? But, so, right, exactly. As Phil's saying, it's, in this example that I'm giving, let's say Trump administration, as it did with the OMB memo last week, directs an agency to stop funding for really whatever. If the agency will not comply or people within the agency decide to resist that order in some way, theoretically, this other secondary move that they've been doing, Musk's infiltration of the Treasury payment system, would allow them theoretically to unilaterally stop those payments that an agency is even refusing to stop. So that's why this is so extremely worrying. And this part, the Treasury part, is notably part of the sort of plumbing of the federal government that other administrations previously haven't touched in this kind of like direct of a political manipulation way.
Yeah, typically when like Republican administrations want to essentially slow the roll of programs they don't like, the typical tactic is one, like you don't fund the programs at the levels that they're requesting. You insert political managers at a few different tiers of the bureaucracy who are they're like fairly young sycophants who don't know anything about policy and just make the lives of people who work in agencies miserable. Like there are all kinds of ways of, accomplishing the goal to some extent, right? This is different in the sense that it's not trying to, merely like slow things down. It is an attempt to like fundamentally kind of reorient how power works in the federal bureaucracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then I guess just to round out this kind of overview, thirdly, they've shut off outside communications from most of the major science agencies. Bea talked about this in her intro also. Ceased publishing major federal reports like the MWR, suspended funding federal grants for scientific research, and scrubbed countless data sets from federal websites. This data purge in particular, a lot of people, I think, have already compared to Nazis purging the sexology archives right from the start, which I think is an apt comparison. But I think it's noteworthy. I think it's interesting and unfortunate that these things like the NIH funding freeze are not talked about in the same breath usually as the OMB memo, because when you look at it, and we'll get into this, the reasoning that they're giving is exactly the same. Right. They're saying as they did with the OMB memo, the NIH grant freeze, the NSF grant freeze, for example, the CDC and other agencies data set purging, all of that is being pursued under the aegis of this purging wokeism and gender ideology and diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility directive. Right. Mm-hmm. And then fourth and final, speaking of Elon Musk's Doge, reports also basically show them going around the country acting like I would characterize as like the fucking SS or something, from wrangling their way into Treasury, as we talked about, to taking over the Office of Personnel Management and the General Services Agency, to reports out of California of them going to shake down federal employees over water management practices. They're very openly exercising power with no real authority to do so, other than the fact that they seem to have been either directed to or have taken the initiative to just go and bully federal employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I think it's important to kind of try and take it all in context together, right? The National Science Foundation funding is a really good example. As a mission, the National Science Foundation, part of what it's supposed to do as an organization is like promote the inclusion of groups who are excluded from scientific research in the research process, right? So like the entire mission of the NSF went against some of these executive orders that said that there needed to be an immediate stop to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in all capacity.
Yeah,
right?
Trump has told them to stop doing the thing that Congress has deemed that they are supposed to be doing at its core.
Yeah, like there's a disabled researcher who's a listener of ours that I heard from who studies plants and said that they were supposed to go on a research trip that they had to cancel because they couldn't take out the money that they needed to actually finish paying for the trip as a result of the freeze. Now that freeze ended over the weekend, but it also, I think, just kind of speaks to the way that these pronouncements are interfacing with the architecture of the state, which is really important to understand and spend some time thinking about. But a lot of the coverage, as you said, Artie, has been about kind of like itemizing, like what's frozen, what's not. What are they doing? Who's doing it? What have they said about what they're doing? Rather than trying to make clear how all these pieces fit together and like what the total picture is of what's happening, right? Which is,
to hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.